Okay, I'm starting the timer now. I'm going to try to save the world in 10 minutes. So I've got a message to the world, and I've got a message to Jon Stewart. Jon Stewart has been doing a fantastic podcast by the name of The Problem with Jon Stewart. He's asking all the right questions of all the right people, and most of whom are not telling him what he's looking for. I went through the same problem, John, many years ago, about a decade ago. I started going to the very apex of the system, asking the people that have been there forever, that are professionals, that we're supposedly supposed to trust, and I asked them straightforward questions to basically have them reveal everything that they knew to me as if they were going to do that. You were prepared, you did some great stuff, but ultimately, I think it's this, the final, the piece that I've seen so far, this guy Jackson, okay, really brought it, and your reaction to it is fantastic. But I've got to simultaneously try to deliver this message to Jon Stewart and the rest of the world. Look, the entire power structure of the United States, as well as the globe, is under the thumb of corruption. And this corruption has completely hijacked and betrayed everything that this country is supposed to be. I know it sounds like hyperbole. It's not. Ultimately, I'm a guy that is a muckraker journalist. My name is Patrick Lovell. I've been asked by my colleagues, what I call the angels, to try to put this this pitch together in less than 10 minutes, and it reminds me of my namesake, a guy by the name of James Lovell, who my father is supposedly third cousins of, but because I'm from Houston, Texas originally, and James Lovell, blah, blah, blah. He was the captain of Apollo 13, and if you think about the scene where they were re-entering the atmosphere and they had to reconfigure the entire capsule to be able to get the right telemetry, otherwise they're going to bounce out into the universe, never to be seen from again. That's kind of the pressure that I'm under right now, and that's why I'm trying to talk low, because I've got to think clearly about how to deliver this message to you guys in a way that's going to try to stop the world and stop the world in its tracks, because the madness is that we could be literally on the verge of World War III, because Putin said this morning in the front page of the New York Times that the sanctions of the West are a declaration of war. Of course, we've heard the last couple of days that Putin's got his finger on the nuclear button and he's itchy, and he may have been a little bit crazy. But why is Putin invading Ukraine at this time? In context, the Russian ruble basically losing all of its value and everything that constitutes. And how does that have anything to do with what I'm trying to tell you, Jon Stewart, about your questions being in the right place, but in the wrong way because you didn't know what questions to ask? Look, I've been on a monumental journey that's literally taken 13 years of my life. The Con, the television series that we put together, has all of the answers that you're looking for. It's at www.thecon.tv. Ultimately, the 2008 great financial crisis was created a specific way that led to a specific outcome that has created the world we live in, and it's all been one giant, massive deception and cover-up ever since, to continue the scheme that you're asking about, John. You keep continuing to ask about corruption, but none of them have told you anywhere close what they know, except, and I'm talking about your guest from, of course, Jamie Dimon. He's not going to tell you about any of that because he's at the apex of this and you didn't know what questions to ask, and that's unfortunate. But, Janet Yellen, are you kidding me? Gary Gensler, and then ultimately Stephanie Kelton and Rohan Gray, my God, they know about this stuff because they've worked with a guy that's my mentor who taught me all of this stuff from the very beginning, and they didn't let you know about it, so I have to, okay? That doesn't mean that, that what they're saying isn't important, and what they want to do isn't really the thing that could potentially save ourselves from ourselves. But I need the world to understand, most notably you at the moment, Jon Stewart, that you can't get anywhere unless you solve the riddle of corruption. They've got an ironclad grip on power, and you know pretty much how they do, because that's what's been informed in all of these different interviews, particularly with this guy Jackson. But ultimately, what I'm about to tell you is just a snippet of what I could, because I got to keep this sharp. And this goes for you in the world, okay, guys? So at the aftermath of the 2008 great financial crisis, the entire system basically pulled a dog and pony show to make sure that you didn't understand what happened. They buried the evidence of what we show in the Con, and ultimately they provided $29 trillion to the bad actors that blew up the world. And then they gave us a PR scenario where they bad actors paid supposedly, and I'm talking about the too big to fail banks, $250 billion in fines, but due to the cost of business there, they got $29 trillion to be able to save themselves from their own insane criminal behavior, which was criminal every step of the way. And it was run by what I've learned from Bill Black, which is called control fraud, and it's run by the CEOs through perverse incentives. The 2008 great financial crisis was the third act of what started in the S&L crisis. We had the S&L crisis. We actually had the global run in derivatives with long-term capital management in 1998. Then we had the dot-com bust, and then we had Enron and WorldCom and Tyco. All of those things are variations of the same thing. And then so was the 2008 great financial crisis, and same what happened in 2019 that nobody knows about, and then whatever comes next. So we spent $29 trillion. So there's 1,000 trillion in a billion. There's 1,000 billion in a trillion. And our budgets in the United States are roughly $25 trillion GDP, I should say. Ultimately, the 2008 financial crisis created a $46 trillion hit to the economy. And ultimately, all of these guys did it because it was a criminal enterprise every step of the way. Control fraud is a methodology, and it's on display in the con at www.thecon.tv. But the one thing I wanted to try to express to you all is just the human component of what it is that we show in the con. Look, we had to, initially, I went, like Jon Stewart is now, to all of the top brass to try to get them to tell me stories that, would reveal the truth of everything that I was looking for, right? Wrong. That's not how these people that have been around this whole system for the last 30 years operate. What they're doing is they're telling you what you want to hear without telling you what they know. Okay, that's first and foremost. I made the analogy the other day. It's like asking literally Tommy Lee and Pamela what it's like to kiss on camera knowing what we know. I mean, it's that absurd, John. So ultimately what we discover in the con was what the actual criminal enterprise was, okay? We always, in the aftermath of the 2008 great financial crisis, everybody is trying to blame the victim, okay? That's what we do in this country. They blame it on subprime. That's a misnomer. It wasn't subprime that created this disaster. Adam McKay got it wrong in The Big Short, and ultimately everybody got it wrong because it was all predicated on liar's loans. Liar's loans that were perversely incentivized based on what was coming from the top down called control fraud. Why? Because everybody gets fees. How are they able to create a grift of massive proportions? Well, everybody's got to be in on it, and that's what we call perverse incentives. But the CEO is paid by, what we call modern executive compensation, which is built on next quarter, which is built on, fees and ultimately, volume. And so they had to create a shit ton of volume. And at that time, we had $70 trillion of global capital looking for a safe place to park. And that's because we created a middle class in China because we shopped out the golden goose of the United States to Asia. And then, around the world, pretty much the same thing. And our nation became a nation of middlemen. But we had the myth that we were a consumer economy. We weren't. What we did was we just created debt. And debt fueled this whole situation because a rolling loan knows no loss. But what I'm talking about is that everything was documentation fabrication at the very beginning. The brokers knew exactly what numbers to put in, and they would do by any means necessary because everybody was on the gun through these perverse incentives that they had to create volume. And so ultimately they could lie, steal, or just lie on these documents to basically create on W-2 forms and everything else the numbers that these lenders or these people that were borrowing needed to get approved. So that was one aspect of it. But ultimately you have to understand the entire pipeline of what creates the stopgaps of what they were able to work around. So the next level is that, okay, you've got originators lying to people about how much their house is worth if they're going to refinance, or they can get them to liar loans to get them approved. But then you have the next step, which is called underwriting. Underwriting is supposed to be able to look at what these people's incomes are, what their assets are, do the formula and the calculation based on what interest rates they're going to get that ultimately would define what kind of loans they can be approved for. So they were incentivized by the actual management to be able to approve as many loans as possible because there was this gigantic appetite that was coming from Wall Street to the world because Wall Street was creating literally hundreds of millions of dollars of what we call warehouse lines to be able to get these stuff in the pipeline as quickly as possible. So all of the brokers and the whole process would lie. So the brokers and the underwriters would lie, but it would have to be built on the appraisal value of these houses. And so you had to get the appraisers to basically hyperinflate the appraisal value. Why did they do that? Well, some did it willingly because they made a lot of money to do it, but many didn't because they were ethical and they were professional and they tried to not do it. In fact, 5,000 of them went to the FBI in 2002 to say that they were being incentivized by the lenders to lie on the appraisal values, but nobody listened. And ultimately, the ones that wouldn't play ball got kicked out of the system and the rest ended up playing ball. And so they just maximized the volume on this whole thing to get the lenders to loan against these liars loans, and they kicked it through the system, of which were then what? Triple stamp AAA, I should say, stamp AAA by the credit rating agencies, the biggest of which is Moody's, that's owned by Warren Buffett, who seems to be everybody's favorite investor. This guy owns the freaking motherlode of the operation that basically, it was a fraud shop. And so everybody is paid to lie on all of these different elements of the system to get it approved through the system that then gets put into the securities, that then got put into derivatives, that got put into all of these other, credit default swaps and collateralized debt obligations that we call, financial instruments, which is just basically smoke and mirrors to be able to keep the flow going for international investment at that time. And that's another side of this because of money laundering from all over the world. But ultimately, the credit rating agencies AAA this stuff because he could sell it to pensions made up of teachers and firemen and salt of the earth people, iron workers, people that built this country who saved to try to get their kids through college, live the American dream, own their home, and have a retirement. They got played for dirty money. You know that because you just talked to, I think it was Jackson. You guys were talking about dumb money, not dirty money, dumb money that ultimately constituted what that meant. So, that in a nutshell, in a very abbreviated way, is what the fraud pipeline was that created this massive global contagion that led to a calamity in 2008. It actually started in 2007, and that's important because what we did in 2007 was we put this thing called Maiden Lane in play, which was all of the 13 banks, the major 13 families of the banks came together under the guidance of then Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, where he explained to them, look, we got to maneuver the situation so we can prevent contagion because, of course, Hank Paulson came from Goldman, and a big part of the Goldman growth was these mortgage-backed securities. And ultimately, he's saying, okay, we got to protect the scenario. So they created what was called Maiden Lane, which was emergency stimulus to try to prevent a global run on, at that point, Bear Stearns. But it created a house of cards, global contagion, ultimately, that led to the 2008 great financial collapse of Lehman Brothers, which was the largest bankruptcy in history, which is part and parcel to the whole thing. And then ultimately what we did after that was we created what was known as Congress rallies around. We're in this transition between Bush, who was the ultimate henchman that allowed this to happen, and then ultimately Obama comes as the cleanup guy. And we were sold that there was $750 billion in TARP, which people were nuts about, to create liquidity in the markets to save everybody's pension and everything else, which never happened. And ultimately what we really did, though, was we created this pathway of the Federal Reserve to create emergency stimulus under what we call the Federal Reserve Act 13.3, which was this emergency a situation within the Federal Reserve that if there's a global calamity and a meltdown, that they can pump as much money as they need to in the system. What they did was they put $29 trillion into the hands of the bastards that destroyed the world. And ultimately, then they charged them $250 billion in this kind of like throwaway fee that the AG, Eric Holder, and everybody were in on. And ultimately, that's what leads us to MAGA. Okay? So they targeted African Americans and what created the 60% evaporation of household African American wealth because they were targets of predation first, but so too were the white working class, which is dumb money. Okay? All of that is in display in the con, by the way. And all of it was this tireless work that we did in this miraculous situation where I was doing like you, John. I was going to the top guys. I was literally asking the top guys at first, how does this thing work? And when you're asking the top guys who are super educated, who don't want to tell you the story, they'll tell you what you want to hear, and they're not going to tell you what you don't know, which is on display when you do these interviews with guys like Janet Yellen and Jamie Dimon especially, as well as Stephanie Kelton and Rohan Gray, and the only one who really laid it out for you, in my opinion, was this guy Jackson. Everybody else was playing their own game and their own agenda, okay? What the truth you're looking for is in the con, okay? But that goes for the rest of the world. Why? Because what we're in the midst of at this moment, literally this morning on the front page of the New York Times, it says that Vladimir Putin has declared that if the West does this furthering sanctions, that's a declaration of war. I think we've heard the last couple of weeks that Putin's got his finger on the nuclear trigger and everything that could go. I mean, if you know anything about World War I, I mean, the stuff with Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, I mean, which led to ultimately, the calamity of World War I and 40 million deaths at that time. It seems a lot more precarious to me right now, but it's all predicated on what I'm trying to tell you, because we spent $29 trillion to backstop this madness. And John, let me tell you something. Stephanie Kelton told you about her colleague, a guy by the name of Randall Wray. Randall Wray and the Levy Institute are the guys that put these figures together. When you asked about the cost of fraud and everything that constitutes the fraud that they didn't answer, they also didn't tell you that they've worked closely with this guy, Randall Wray, who was the one who did the investigation. And Randall Wray, by the way, has told me that literally 40% of those loans were probably illegal. Okay, so there's that. What I'm about to tell you, I could go on for days. I could literally go on for months. But the problem is nobody has that much bandwidth. But what I'm trying to tell you is that you got to stop the world in its tracks. Me, you, anybody who cares, because what I've been trying to tell the public for the last month is that the New York Times hid this, the Chicago Tribune, the Miami Herald, the Dallas Morning News, the Los Angeles Times, none of them brought the full story together, for one, because they're all kind of waiting to see what the DOJ and the FBI did. But at the same time, there's this money influence of hedge funds that have purchased papers throughout the country. Don't believe me? Look at 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago. They did a scratch the surface, version of this last week, like they always do. And then ultimately, then you got billionaires involved with this whole thing. And what's important to billionaires? You know it more than anybody, because you continue to ask the same question, right? Because ultimately, what you need to understand, John, in the world you need to understand is we've got a Federal Reserve that has been backstopping this incredible criminal racket to the tune of trillions of dollars, and it's not supply and demand. Like you said earlier, John, today, you said it's not capitalism. No, it's not capitalism, dude. Capitalism requires risk and reward, right? But that's not what this is. This is a sure thing, which it means it's racketeering. But it's so beyond your comprehension, John. Listen, when I say that, at the beginning of this whole situation, when Bear Stearns went sideways and we had what was known as the House of Cards, it was the Federal Reserve that stepped up and they created literally BlackRock as the administrator of the Maiden Lane funds that preceded all of this. And why do you think BlackRock is the king of the world right now? Because they're acting on behalf of the U.S. government and they bought everything. This is so beyond Orwellian. This is so beyond the worst criminal activity you could possibly ever think of. And it could potentially trigger World War III. I don't know, but the calamity that it's already created, tens of millions of people lost their homes. There's probably, who knows how many divorces, how many freaking suicides. But the thing is, real people have been devastated, John, is where you're coming from. But I'm trying to connect with you real people out there to understand that you got played, you got set up, and they've been lying to you the whole time, and the truth is in the con. You got to check out www.thecon.tv, and then check me out on Patrick Lovell, Truth Bombs, The Con, and some other things that are going on. But man, I just want to try to briefly say this. Look, we had real people in our story, okay? Michael Winston was a hero at Countrywide. His story is incredible. The guy's gone through 30 surgeries on a throat cancer called laryngeal cancer because of this situation, and he's laid his life on the line and sacrificed more than any of us could possibly understand to be able to try to bring this truth that nobody paid attention to. He's one piece of the puzzle. We've got a guy by the name of Richard Bowen. My God, Richard Bowen. Richard Bowen had probably one of the most heroic people in the history of the world. He was the chief underwriter for Citigroup, and ultimately he went to his boss and his boss's boss, and he tried to prevent Citigroup from getting away with selling $90 billion a year in illegal securities, which ultimately blew up the world. And then in the end, in the aftermath, of course, none other than Robert Rubin, a guy who started off as CEO at Goldman Sachs, and then he became Treasury Secretary for Clinton, and then ultimately he came in to clean up the Citigroup business, got away with lying to the FCIC and all of the investigators because of what they hid that Richard Bowen was revealing, which Richard Bowen told everything to Robert Rubin and everybody else. And we proved it because the reason you got to understand this is crazy too, John, and the rest of the world, is that the National Archives recently asked the Department of Justice to investigate President Trump for flushing a lot of top secret documents down the toilet of the White House. Okay, that's incredible. And Trump plays a lot of roles in this thing. But what the National Archives didn't do was ask the Department of Justice or whomever to go into what Richard Bowen was saying, and we found miraculously evidence of how Citigroup and Robert Rubin ran circles around this investigation, and they lied. And why do they lie? Because Citigroup was guilty of criminal conspiracy, which was racketeering, and then ultimately, because of who Robert Rubin was able to do a song and dance at the FCIC, the Federal Crisis Inquiry Commission, that they didn't hold accountable. And what was the result? Robert Rubin walked with like $120 million for that short maneuver, but Citigroup got $3 trillion. $3 trillion of that $29 trillion that I'm talking about. And by the way, John, that $29 trillion was in 2009. It just created more of the same that we ended up having an $11.9 trillion scenario in 2019, which is exactly what this guy Jackson told you about. You didn't go into details, but there's so much more. And my God, it's all on display in the con. And, Richard Bowen, literally, I can't tell you the sacrifice he's gone through to get this truth out there. And I'm the only one that's been able to get it from him because everybody else has hidden this. And so, John, and the rest of the world, please understand, and I've been saying this over and over, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, all of media has hidden this. Rachel Maddow literally, I think, gets paid $30 million to make sure you don't know this. I mean, that's the situation. Same with Tucker Carlson. I don't even know how to explain what I'm going to call the stupidity of CNN. I mean, that organization is an absolute monstrosity of a joke, but this is an op-ed editorial too, so whatever. I mean, look, I'm going to just finish with this. Guys, don't let World War III happen because they're all covering up corruption. Don't let our country lose, 248 years of our evolution in order to form a more perfect union, end like this. Please. I guess I'm out of time. I doubled up my time. There's more. There's so much more. There's way more. Oh my God. I just pray that people stop what they're doing and pay attention to what I'm telling them, because I'm the only one who's actually been able to go the distance. And I'm telling you, John, I'd love to go with you arm in arm, because you're definitely asking the right questions. I don't know if your gatekeepers are going to let this information get to you. I just pray that thousands upon thousands of people who are checking us out in different social media platforms, take it upon themselves to blitz tweet Jon Stewart or The Problem on Twitter, Twitter storm, of this information that we've got. God, I could go on forever.